Bluebeard by Kurt Vonnegut. Part 2, Chapters 5 through 9. Read by Ron Gabaldon. 5. One art publication claimed to know exactly what was in there. The very greatest of the abstract expressionist paintings, which I was keeping off the market in order to raise the value of relatively unimportant paintings in the house here. Not true. After the article was printed, my fellow Armenian in Southampton, Kevork Havusinian, made a serious offer of $3 million for everything in the barn, sight unseen. I wouldn't want to cheat you in that way, I told him. That would be un-Armenian. If I had taken his money, it would have been like selling him the Brooklyn Bridge. One response to that same article wasn't that amusing. A man whose name I did not recognize said in a letter to the editor that he had known me during the war, which he evidently did. He was at least familiar with my platoon of artists, which he described accurately. He knew the mission we were given after the German Air Force had been knocked out of the sky, and there was no longer any need for the big-time camouflage jokes we played. This was the mission, which was like turning children loose in the workshop of Father Christmas. We were to evaluate and catalog all captured works of art. This man said he had served in Shafe, and I must have dealt with him from time to time. It was his belief, as stated in his letter, that I had stolen masterpieces which should have been returned to their rightful owners in Europe. Fearing lawsuits brought by those rightful owners, he said, I had locked them up in the barn. Wrong. He is wrong about the contents of the barn. I have to say he is just a little bit right about my having taken advantage of my unusual wartime opportunities. I couldn't have stolen anything which was handed over by the military units which had captured it. I had to give them receipts, and we were visited regularly by auditors from the Finance Corps. But our travels behind the lines did bring us into contact with persons in desperate circumstances who had art to sell. We got some remarkable bargains. Nobody in the platoon got an old master, or anything which obviously came from a church or a museum, or a great private collection. At least I don't think anybody did. I can't be absolutely sure about that. In the art world, as everywhere, opportunists are opportunists, and thieves are thieves. But I myself did buy from a civilian an unsigned charcoal sketch which looked like a Cézanne to me, and which had since been authenticated as such. It is now a part of the permanent collection of the Rhode Island School of Design. And I bought a Matisse, my favorite painter, from a widow who said her husband had been given it by the artist himself. For that matter, I got stuck with a fake Gauguin, which served me right. And I sent my purchases for safekeeping to just about the only person I knew and could trust in the whole United States of America anymore. Sam Wu, a Chinese laundryman in New York City who was a cook for a little while for my former master, the illustrator Dan Gregory. Imagine fighting for a country where the only civilian you know is a Chinese laundryman. And then one day I and my platoon of artists were ordered into combat to contain, if we could, the last big German breakthrough of World War II. But none of that stuff is in the barn, or even in my possession. I sold it all when I got home from the war, which gave me a nice little bankroll to invest in the stock market. I had given up on my boyhood dream of being an artist. I enrolled in courses in accounting and economics and business law and marketing and so on at New York University. I was going to be a businessman. I thought this about myself and art, that I could catch the likeness of anything I could see, with patience, and the best instruments and materials. I had, after all, been an able apprentice under the most meticulous illustrator of this century, Dan Gregory. But cameras could do what he had done and what I could do, and I knew that this was the same thought which had sent the Impressionists and the Cubists and the Dadaists and the Surrealists and so on in their quite successful efforts to make good pictures which cameras and people like Dan Gregory could not duplicate. I concluded that my mind was so ordinary, which is to say empty, that I could never be anything but a reasonably good camera. So I would content myself with a more common and general sort of achievement than serious art, which was money. I was not saddened about this. I was, in fact, much relieved. But I still enjoyed engaging in the blather of art, since I could talk, if not paint pictures, as well as anyone. So I would go to bars around NYU at night, and easily made friends with several painters who thought they were right about almost everything, but who never expected to receive much recognition. I could talk as well as the best of them, and drink as much as they could. Best of all, I could pick up the check at the end of the evening, thanks to the money I was making in the stock market, subsistence payments I was receiving from the government while going to the university, and a lifetime pension from the grateful nation for having given one of my eyes in the defense of liberty. To the real painters, I seemed a bottomless pit of money. I was good not only for the cost of drinks, but for rent, for a down payment on a car, for a girlfriend's abortion, for a wife's abortion, you name it. However much money they needed for no matter what, they could get it from Diamond Rabo Karabakian. So I bought those friends. My pit of money wasn't really bottomless. By the end of every month, they had taken me for everything I had. But then the pit, a small one, would fill up again. Fair was fair. I certainly enjoyed their company, especially since they treated me as though I were a painter too. I was one of them. Here was another big family to replace my lost platoon. And they paid me back with more than companionship. They settled their debts as best they could with pictures nobody wanted to. I almost forgot to say, I was married and my wife was pregnant at the time. She would be twice impregnated by that incomparable lover, Rabo Karabakian. I have now returned to this typewriter from the vicinity of the swimming pool, where I asked Celeste and her friends in and around that public teenage athletic facility if they knew who Bluebeard was. I meant to mention Bluebeard in this book. I wanted to know if I had to explain, for the sake of young readers, who Bluebeard was. Nobody knew. While I was at it, I asked them if they recognized the names of Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, or Terry Kitchen, or Truman Capote, or Nelson Algren, or Irwin Shaw, or James Jones, all of whom had figured not only in the history of arts and letters, but in the history of the Hamptons. They did not. So much for achieving immortality via the arts and letters. So, Bluebeard is a fictitious character in a very old children's tale, possibly based loosely on a murderous nobleman of long ago. In the story, he is married many times. He marries for the umpteenth time and brings his latest child bride back to his castle. He tells her that she can go into any room but one, whose door he shows her. Bluebeard is either a poor psychologist or a great one, since all his new wife can think about is what might be behind the door. So she takes a look when she thinks he isn't home, but he really is home. He catches her just at the point she is gazing aghast at the bodies of all his former wives in there, all of whom he has murdered, save for the first one, for looking behind the door. The first one got murdered for something else. So, of all the people who know about my locked potato barn, the one who finds the mystery most intolerable is surely Circe Berman. She is after me all the time to tell her where the 6 keys are, and I tell her again that they are buried in a golden casket at the foot of Mount Ararat. I said to her the last time she asked, which was about 5 minutes ago, "Look, think about something else. Anything else. I am Bluebeard, and my studio is my forbidden chamber as far as you're concerned." 6. The Bluebeard story notwithstanding, there are no bodies in my barn. The first of my 2 wives, who was and is Dorothy, remarried soon after our divorce. Remarried happily, from all accounts. Dorothy is now a widow in a beachfront condominium in Sarasota, Florida. Her second husband was what we both thought I might become right after the war, a capable and personable insurance man. We each have a beach. My second wife, dear Edith, is buried in Green River Cemetery out here, where I expect to be buried too, only a few yards, in fact, from the graves of Jackson Pollock and Terry Kitchen. If I killed anybody in the war, and I just might have, it would have been during the few seconds before a shell from somewhere knocked me unconscious and took out one eye. When I was a 2-eyed boy, I was the best draftsman that they'd ever seen in the rinky-dink public school system of San Ignacio, California, which wasn't saying much. Several of my teachers were so impressed that they suggested to my parents that perhaps I should pursue a career as an artist. But this advice seemed so impractical to my parents that they asked the teachers to stop putting such ideas in my head. They thought that artists lived in poverty, and that they had to die before their works were appreciated. They were generally right about that, of course. The paintings by dead men who were poor most of their lives are the most valuable pieces in my collection. And if an artist wants to really jack up the prices of his creations, may I suggest this? Suicide. But in 1927, when I was 11 years old, and was incidentally well on my way to becoming as good a cobbler as my father, My mother read about an American artist who made as much money as many movie stars and tycoons, and was in fact the friend and equal of movie stars and tycoons, and had a yacht, and a horse farm in Virginia, and a beach house in Montauk, not far from here. Mother would say later, and not all that much later, since she had only one more year to live, that she never would have read that article if it hadn't been for a photograph of this rich artist on his yacht. The name of the yacht was the name of the mountain as sacred to Armenians as Fujiyama is to the Japanese, Ararat. This man had to be an Armenian, she thought, and so he was. The magazine said he had been born Dan Gregorian in Moscow, where his father was a horse trainer, and that he had been apprenticed to the chief engraver of the Russian Imperial Mint. He had come to this country in 1907 as an ordinary immigrant, not a refugee from any massacre, and had changed his name to Dan Gregory, and had become an illustrator of magazine stories and advertisements, and of books for young people. The author of the article said he was probably the highest paid artist in American history. That could still be true of Dan Gregory, or Gregorian, as my parents always called him, if his income in the 1920s, or especially during the Great Depression, were translated into the depreciated dollars of today. He could still be the champ, living or dead. My mother was shrewd about the United States, as my father was not. She had figured out that the most pervasive American disease was loneliness, and that even people at the top often suffered from it, and that they could be surprisingly responsive to attractive strangers who were friendly. So my mother said to me, and I hardly recognized her, so sly and witch-like her face had become, "You must write to this Gregorian. You must tell him that you are also Armenian. You must tell him that you want to be an artist half as good as he is, and that you think he is the greatest artist who ever lived." So I wrote such a letter, or about 20 such letters in my childish long hand, until Mother was satisfied that the bait was irresistible. I did this hard work in an acrid cloud of my father's raillery. He said things like, "He stopped being an Armenian when he changed his name," and "If he grew up in Moscow, he's a Russian, not an Armenian," and "You know what a letter like that would mean to me? The next one asks for money." And my mother said to him in Armenian, "Can't you see we're fishing? If you make so much noise talking, you'll scare the fish away." In Turkish Armenia, incidentally, or so I've been told, it was the women and not the men who were the fisher folk. And what a terrific bite my letter got! We hooked Dan Gregory's mistress, a former Ziegfeld Follies showgirl named Marley Camp. This one would become the very first woman I ever made love to, at the age of 19. And oh my God, what a fuddy-duddy old poop I am, thinking about that sexual initiation as though it were as marvelous as the Chrysler Building, while the 15-year-old daughter of my cook is taking birth control pills. Marley Camp said that she was Mr. Gregory's assistant, and that she and he had been deeply moved by my letter. Mr. Gregory, as I might imagine, was a very busy man, and had asked her to reply for him. This was a 4-page letter, written in a scrawl almost as childish as my own. She was then only 21 years old, the daughter of an illiterate coal miner in West Virginia. When she was 37, she would be the Countess Porto Maggiore, with a pink palace in Florence, Italy. When she was 50, she would be the biggest Sony distributor in Europe, and that old continent's greatest collector of American post-war modern art. My father said she had to be crazy to write such a long letter to a stranger, and nothing but a boy at that, so far away. Mother said she must be very lonely, which was true. Gregory kept her as a pet around the house because she was so beautiful, and he used her as a model sometimes. But she was certainly no assistant in his business. He had no interest in her opinions about anything. He never included her in his dinner parties either, never took her on trips or to a show or out to restaurants or to other people's parties, or introduced her to his famous friends. Marley Kemp wrote me 78 letters between 1927 and 1933. I can count them because I still have them, now bound in a hand-tooled leather volume in a slipcase in the library. The binding and slipcase were a gift from dear Edith on our 10th wedding anniversary. Mrs. Berman has found it, as she has found everything of any emotional significance here but the keys to the barn. She has read all the letters without first asking me if I considered them private, which I surely do. And she has said to me, and this is the first time she has ever sounded awed, "Just one of this woman's letters says more wonderful things about life than every picture in this house. They're the story of a scorned and abused woman discovering that she was a great writer. Because that is what she became, I hope you know that." "I know that," I said. It was certainly true. Each letter is deeper, more expressive, more confident, and more self-respecting than the one before. "How much education did she have?" she asked. "1 year of high school," I said. Mrs. Berman shook her head in wonder. "What a year that must have been," she said. As for my side of the correspondence, my main messages were pictures I had made, which I thought she would show to Dan Gregory, with brief notes attached. After I told Marley that Mother had died of tetanus from the cannery, her letters became very motherly, although she was only 9 years older than me. And the first of these motherly letters came not from New York City, but from Switzerland, where she said in a letter she had gone to ski. Only after I visited her in her palace in Florence after the war did she tell me the truth. Dan Gregory had sent her alone to a clinic there to get rid of the fetus she was carrying. "I should have thanked Dan for that," she said to me in Florence. "That's when I got interested in foreign languages," she laughed. Mrs. Berman has just told me that my cook has had not just one abortion like Marilee Kemp, but 3, and not in Switzerland, but in a doctor's office in Southampton. This wearied me, but then almost everything about the modern world wearies me. I didn't ask where the cooks carrying Celeste for a full 9 months fit in with the abortions. I didn't want to know. But Mrs. Berman gave me the information anyway. 2 abortions before Celeste, and 1 after, she said. "The cook told you that?" I said. "Celeste told me," she said. "She also told me that her mother was thinking about having her tubes tied." "I'm certainly glad to know all this," I said, "in case of an emergency." Back to the past I go again, with the present nipping at my ankles like a rabid fox terrier. My mother died believing that I had become a protege of Dan Gregory, from whom I had never heard directly. Before she got sick, she predicted that Gregorian would send me to art school, that Gregorian would persuade magazines to hire me as an illustrator when I was old enough, that Gregorian would introduce me to all of his rich friends, who would tell me how I would get rich too, investing money I made as an artist in the stock market. In 1928, the stock market never seemed to do anything but go up and up, just like the one we have today. Whoopee! So she not only missed the stock market crash a year later, but the realization a couple of years after the crash that I wasn't even indirectly in touch with Dan Gregory, that he probably didn't even know I was alive, that the effusive praise for the artwork I was sending to New York for criticism wasn't coming from the highest paid artist in American history, but from what my father called an Armenian, maybe his cleaning woman, maybe his cook, maybe his whore. 7. I remember the afternoon I came home from school when I was about 15 or so, and Father was sitting at the oilcloth-covered table in our little kitchen, with Marilee's letters in a stack before him. He had reread them all. This was not a violation of my privacy. The letters were family property, if you can call only 2 people a family. They were like bonds we had accumulated, gilt-edged securities of which I would be the beneficiary when they and I reached maturity. Once they paid off, I would be able to take care of Father, too, and he sure needed help. His savings had been wiped out by the failure of the Luma County Savings and Loan Association, which we and everybody in town had taken to calling El Banco Busto. There was no federal insurance scheme for bank deposits back then. El Banco Busto, moreover, had held the mortgage on the little building whose first floor was Father's shop, and whose second story was our home. Father used to own the building, thanks to a loan from the bank. After the bank failed, though, its receivers liquidated all its assets, foreclosing all the mortgages which were in arrears, which was most of them. Guess why they were in arrears? Practically everybody had been dumb enough to entrust their savings to El Banco Busto. So the father I found reading Marilee's letters in the afternoon was a man who had become a mere tenant in a building he used to own. As for the shop downstairs, it was vacant, since he couldn't afford to rent that too. All his machinery had been sold at auction anyway, in order to get a few pennies for what we were, people who had been dumb enough to entrust his or her savings to El Banco Busto. What a comedy! Father looked up from Marilee's letters when I came in with my school books, and he said, "You know what this woman is? She has promised you everything, but she has nothing to give." He named the Armenian sociopath who had swindled him and Mother in Cairo. "She is the new Vartan Mamegonian," he said. "What do you mean?" I said. And he said exactly as though the handwritten letters were bonds or insurance policies or whatever. "I have just read the fine print," He went on to say that Marilee's first letters had been rich in phrases like Mr. Gregory says, and Mr. Gregory feels, and Mr. Gregory wants you to know, but that since the third letter, such locutions had entirely disappeared. "This is a nobody," he said, "who will never be anybody, who is trying to get somebody anyway by stealing the reputation of Gregorian." I felt no shock. Some part of me had noticed the same thing about the letters. Some other part of me had managed to bury the bad implications. I asked Father what had triggered this investigation at this time. He indicated 10 books which had arrived for me from Marilee soon after I left for school. He had stacked them on the drain board of our sink, a sink full of dirty dishes and pans. I examined them. They were young people's story classics of the day: Treasure Island, Robinson Crusoe, The Swiss Family Robinson, The Adventures of Robin Hood and His Merry Men, Tanglewood Tales, Gulliver's Travels, Tales from Shakespeare, and so on. Reading matter for young people before the Second World War was a dozen universes removed from the unwanted pregnancies and incest and minimum wage slavery and treacherous high school friendships and so on in the novels of Polly Madison. Marilee had sent me these books because they were vibrantly illustrated by Dan Gregory. They were not only the most beautiful artifacts in our apartment, they were about the most beautiful artifacts in all of Luma County, and I responded to them as such. "How nice of her!" I exclaimed. "Would you look at these? Would you look at these?" "I have," he said. "Aren't they beautiful?" I said. "Yes," he said, "they are beautiful, but maybe you can explain to me why Mr. Gregorian, who thinks so highly of you, hasn't signed at least one of them, and perhaps scribbled a little note of encouragement to my gifted son." All of this was said in Armenian. He never talked anything but Armenian at home after the failure of El Banco Busto. Whether the advice and encouragement had come from Gregory or Marilee didn't matter much to me at that point. If I do say so myself, I had become one hell of a good artist for a kid in any case. I was so conceited about my prospects, with or without help from New York City, that I defended Marilee's mainly to cheer up Father. "If this Marilee, whoever she is, whatever she is, thinks so much of your pictures," he said, "why doesn't she sell some of them and send you the money?" "She's been extremely generous," I replied. And so she had been, generous with her time, but also with the finest artists' materials then available anywhere. I had no idea of their value, and neither did she. She had taken them without permission from the supply room in the basement of Gregory's mansion. I myself would see that room in a couple of years, and there was enough stuff in there to take care of Gregory's needs, as prolific as he was, for a dozen lifetimes. She didn't think he would miss what she sent me, and she didn't ask permission because she was scared to death of him. He used to hit and kick her a lot. But about the actual value of the stuff. The paints I were using sure weren't Sateen Duralux. They were Mussini oils and Horadam watercolors from Germany. My brushes came from Windsor and Newton in England. My pastels and colored pencils and inks came from Lefebvre Fionvert in Paris. My canvas came from Claessens in Belgium. No other artist west of the Rockies had such priceless art supplies. For that matter, Dan Gregory was the only illustrator I ever knew who expected his pictures to take their places among the great art treasures of the world, who used materials which might really do what Sateen Duralux was supposed to do, outlast the smile on the Mona Lisa. The rest of them were satisfied if their work survived the trip to the print shop. They commonly sneered that they did such hack work only for money, that it was art for the people who didn't know anything about art. But not Dan Gregory. "She is using you," said my father. "For what?" I said. "So she can feel like a big shot," he said. The widow Berman agrees that Marilee was using me, but not in the way my father thought. "You were her audience," she said. "Writers will kill for an audience." "An audience of one?" I said. "That's all she needed," she said. "That's all anybody needs. Just look at how her handwriting improved and her vocabulary grew. Look at all the things she found to talk about as soon as she realized you were hanging on every word. She certainly couldn't write for that bastard Gregory. There was no point in writing to the folks back home either. They couldn't even read. Did you really believe her when she said she was describing things she saw around the city because you might want to paint pictures of them?" "Yes," I said. "I guess I did." Marilee wrote long descriptions of breadlines for all the people who had been put out of work by the Depression, and of men in nice suits who obviously used to have money but were now selling apples on street corners, and of a legless man on a sort of skateboard who was a World War I veteran, or was pretending to be one, selling pencils in Grand Central Station. and of high society people thrilled to be hobnobbing with gangsters in speakeasies, that sort of thing. That's the secret of how to enjoy writing, and how to make yourself meet high standards, said Mrs. Berman. You don't write for the whole world, and you don't write for 10 people, or 2. You write for just one person. Who's the one person you write for, I asked. And she said, this is going to sound very strange, because you'd think it would be somebody the same age as my readers, but it isn't. That's the secret ingredient of my books, I think. That's why they seem so strong and trustworthy to young people. Why I don't sound like one dumb teenager talking to another one. I don't put anything down on paper which Abe Berman wouldn't find interesting and truthful. Abe Berman, of course, was her brain surgeon husband who died of a stroke 7 months ago. She has asked me for the keys to the barn again. I told her if she ever mentioned the barn again, I was going to tell everybody that she was really Polly Madison, invite the local papers to come on over and interview her, and so on. If I actually did that, it would not only wreck Paul Slazenger, it would also attract a lynch mob of religious fundamentalists to our doorstep. I happened to watch the sermon of a television evangelist the other night, and he said Satan was making a 4-pronged attack on the American family with communism, drugs, rock and roll, and books by Satan's sister, who was Polly Madison. To return to my correspondence with Marilee Kemp, my notes to her cooled after Father denounced her as the new Vartan Mamegonian. I was no longer counting on her for anything. Simply as part of the growing up process, I didn't want her to go on trying to be my substitute mother. I was becoming a man and didn't need a mother anymore, or so I thought. Without any help from her, in fact, I had started to make money as an artist. As young as I was, and right there in bankrupt little San Ignacio, I had gone to the local paper, the Luma County Clarion, looking for work of any kind after school, and had mentioned that I could draw pretty well. The editor asked me if I could draw a picture of the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, Dan Gregory's hero of heroes, incidentally, and I did so in 2 or 3 minutes maybe, without having to refer to a photograph. Then he had me draw a beautiful female angel, and I did that. Then he had me draw a picture of Mussolini pouring a quart of something into the mouth of the angel. He had me label the bottle Castor Oil and the angel World Peace. Mussolini liked to punish people by making them drink a quart of castor oil. That sounded like a comical way to teach somebody a lesson, but it wasn't. The victims often vomited and shit themselves to death. Those who survived were all torn up inside. That is how I became a paid political cartoonist at a tender age. I did 1 cartoon a week, with the editor telling me exactly what to draw. Much to my surprise, Father began to blossom as an artist too. In all the guessing about where my artistic talent might have come from, one thing seemed certain. It hadn't come from him or from anybody on his side of the family. When he still had his shoe repair shop, I never saw him do anything imaginative with all the scraps lying around. Maybe make a fancy belt for me or a purse for Mother. He was a no-nonsense repairman, and that was all. But then, as though he were in a trance and using the simplest hand tools, he began to make perfectly beautiful cowboy boots, which he sold from door to door. They weren't only tough and comfortable, they were dazzling jewelry for many feet and calves, scintillating with gold and silver stars, and eagles and flowers, and bucking broncos cut from flattened tin cans and bottle caps. But this new development in his life wasn't as nice for me to see as you might think. It gave me the creeps, actually, because I would look into his eyes, and there wasn't anybody home anymore. I would see the same thing happen to Terry Kitchen years later. He used to be my closest friend, and suddenly he began to paint the pictures which make many people say today that he was the greatest of all abstract expressionists, superior to Pollock, superior to Rothko. That was fine, I guess, except that when I looked into my best friend's eyes, there wasn't anybody home anymore. Ah, me. Anyway, back around Christmas in 1932, Marilee's most recent letters were lying around somewhere, mostly unread. I had become bored with being her audience. And then this telegram arrived, addressed to me. Father would comment before we opened it that it was the first telegram our family had ever received. The message was this: "Be my apprentice. Will pay transportation here plus free room, board, modest allowance, art lessons. Dan Gregory." 8. The first person I told about this magnificent opportunity was the old newspaper editor for whom I had been drawing cartoons. His name was Arnold Coates, and he said this to me: "You really are an artist, and you have to get out of here or you'll shrivel up like a raisin. Don't worry about your father. He's a perfectly contented, self-sufficient zombie, if you'll pardon my saying so. New York is just going to be a stopover for you, he went on. Europe is where the real painters are, and always will be. He was wrong about that. I never prayed before, but I'll pray tonight that you never go to Europe as a soldier. We should never get suckered again into providing meat for the cannons and machine guns they love so much. They could go to war at any time. Look how big their armies are in the midst of a Great Depression. If the cities are still standing when you get to Europe, he said, and you sit in a cafe for hours, sipping coffee or wine or beer and discussing painting and music and literature, just remember that the Europeans around you, who you think are so much more civilized than Americans, are looking forward to just one thing, the time when it will become legal to kill each other and knock everything down again. If I had my way, he said, American geography books would call these European countries by their right names. The Syphilis Empire, the Republic of Suicide, Dementia Praecox, which of course borders on beautiful Paranoia. There, he said, I've spoiled Europe for you, and you haven't even seen it yet. Maybe I've spoiled art for you too, but I hope not. I don't see how artists can be blamed if their beautiful and usually innocent creations for some reason just make Europeans unhappy and more bloodthirsty all the time. That was an ordinary way for a patriotic American to talk back then. It's hard to believe how sick of war we used to be. We used to boast of how small our army and navy were, and how little influence generals and admirals had in Washington. We used to call armaments manufacturers merchants of death. Can you imagine that? Nowadays, of course, just about our only solvent industry is the merchandising of death, bankrolled by our grandchildren so that the message of our principal art forms, movies and television and political speeches and newspaper columns for the sake of the economy simply has to be this. War is hell, all right, but the only way a boy can become a man is in a shootout of some kind, preferably, but by no means necessarily on a battlefield. So I went to New York City to be born again. It was and remains easy for most Americans to go somewhere else to start anew. I wasn't like my parents. I didn't have any supposedly sacred piece of land or shoals of friends and relatives to leave behind. Nowhere has the number 0 been more of philosophical value than in the United States. Here goes nothing, says the American as he goes off the high diving board. Yes, and my mind really was as blank as an embryo's as I crossed this great continent on womb-like Pullman cars. It was as though there had never been a San Ignacio. Yes, and when the 20th Century Limited from Chicago plunged into a tunnel under New York City with its lining of pipes and wires, I was out of the womb and into the birth canal. 10 minutes later, I was born in Grand Central Station, wearing the first suit I had ever owned and carrying a cardboard valise and a portfolio of my very best drawings. Who was there to welcome this beguiling Armenian infant? Not a soul. Not a soul. I would have made a great Dan Gregory illustration for a story about a yokel finding himself all alone in a big city he had never been before. I had got my suit through the mail from Sears Roebuck, and nobody could draw cheap mail-order clothes like Dan Gregory. My shoes were old and cracked, but I had shined them and put new rubber heels on them myself. I had also threaded in new laces, but one of those had broken somewhere around Kansas City. A truly observant person would have noticed the clumsy splice in the broken shoelaces. Nobody could describe the economic and spiritual condition of a character in terms of his shoes like Dan Gregory. My face, however, was wrong for a yokel in a magazine story back then. Gregory would have had to make me Anglo-Saxon. He could have used my head in a story about Indians. I would have made a passable Hiawatha. He illustrated an expensive edition of Hiawatha one time, and the model he used for the title character was the son of a Greek fry cook. In the movies back then, just about any big-nosed person whose ancestors came from the shores of a Mediterranean or the Near East, if he could act a little, could play a rampaging Sioux or whatever, the audiences were more than satisfied. Now I yearned to get back on the railroad train. I had been so happy there. How I adored that train. God Almighty himself must have been hilarious when human beings so mingled iron and water and fire as to make a railroad train. Nowadays, of course, everything must be done with plutonium and laser beams. And could Dan Gregory ever paint pictures of railroad trains? He used to work from blueprints he got from the manufacturers, so that a misplaced rivet or whatever wouldn't spoil his picture for that railroad man. And if he had done a picture of the 20th Century Limited the day I arrived, the stains and dirt on the outside would be native to the run between Chicago and New York. Nobody could paint grime like Dan Gregory. And where was he now? Where was Marilee? Why hadn't they sent someone to meet me with his great Marmon touring car? He knew exactly when I was coming. He was the one who had picked the date, an easy one to remember. It was St. Valentine's Day, and he had done me so many kindnesses through the mail, and not through Marilee or any flunky. All the messages were in his own handwriting. They were brief, but they were incredibly generous, too. I was not only to buy a warm suit for myself at his expense, but one for Father, too. His notes were so compassionate. He didn't want me to get scared or make a fool of myself on the train, so he told me how to act in a Pullman berth and on the dining car, when and how much to tip the waiters and porters, and how to change trains in Chicago. He couldn't have been nicer to his own son, if he had had a son. He even went to the trouble of sending me expense money as postal money orders rather than personal checks, which indicated that he knew about the failure of the only bank in San Ignacio. What I didn't know was that back in December, when he sent me the telegram, Marilee was in the hospital with both legs and one arm broken. He had given her a shove in his studio, which sent her backwards and down the staircase. She looked dead when she hit the bottom, and 2 servants happened to be standing there at the bottom of the stairs. So Gregory was scared and remorseful. When he visited Marilee in the hospital for the first time, all shame-faced, he told her he was sorry and loved her so much that he would give anything to her she could think of to ask. Anything. He probably thought it was going to be diamonds or something like that, but she asked for a human being. She asked for me. Circe Berman has just suggested that I was a replacement for the Armenian baby which had been taken from her womb in Switzerland. Maybe so. And then Marilee told Gregory what to say to me in the telegram, and then his letters, and how much money to send me for what, and on and on. She was still in the hospital when I reached New York, but she certainly didn't expect him to stand me up at the station. But that's what he did. He was turning mean again. That wasn't the whole story either. I wouldn't get the whole story until I visited Marilee in Florence after the war. Gregory, incidentally, had been dead and buried in Egypt for about 10 years by then. Only after the war did Marilee, reborn as the Contessa Portamaggiore, tell me that I was the reason she had been pushed down the stairs back in 1932. She had sheltered me from that abashing information, and so, from very different motives, certainly had Dan Gregory. But she came up to his studio the night he nearly killed her to get him to give his serious attention to pictures of mine for the very first time. In all the years I had been sending pictures to New York, he had never looked at one. Marilee thought that this time might be different, since Gregory was happier than she had ever seen him. Why? He had that afternoon received a letter of thanks from the man he believed to be the most brilliant leader on earth, the Italian dictator Mussolini, the man who made his enemies drink castor oil. Mussolini had thanked him for a portrait of himself, which Gregory had painted as a gift. Mussolini was depicted as a general of Alpine troops on a mountaintop at sunrise, and you can bet that every bit of leather and piping and braid and brass and pleating and all the decorations were exactly as they should be. Nobody could paint uniforms like Dan Gregory. Gregory would be shot dead in Egypt 8 years later, incidentally, by the British, while wearing an Italian uniform. But the point is this. Marilee spread out my pictures on a refectory table in the studio, and he knew what they were. As she had hoped, he ambled over to them with all possible amiability. The moment he looked at them closely, though, he flew into a rage. But it wasn't the nature of my pictures which infuriated him. It was the quality of the art materials I had used. No boy artist in California could afford such expensive imported colors and paper and canvas. Marilee, obviously, had taken them from his supply room. So he gave her a shove, and she fell backwards down the stairs. Somewhere in here, I want to tell you about the suit I ordered from Sears Roebuck, along with my own. Father and I measured each other up for suits, which was strange, even in itself, since I can't recall our ever having touched before. But when the suits arrived, it was obvious that somebody somewhere had misplaced a decimal point where Father's pants were concerned. As short as his legs were, his pants were much shorter. As scrawny as he was around the middle, he couldn't button the pants at the waist. The coat fit just perfect, though. So I said to him, "I'm really sorry about the pants. You'll have to send them back." And he said, "No, "I like it very much. It's a very good funeral suit." And I said, "What do you mean funeral suit?" I had this vision of his going to other people's funerals without any pants on. Not that he had ever gone to anybody's funeral but my mother's, as far as I know. And he said, "You don't have to wear pants to your own funeral." When I went back to San Ignacio for his funeral 5 years later, he was laid out in the coat of that suit at least. But the bottom half of the casket was closed, so I had to ask the mortician if Father had put pants on. It turns out that he did, and that the pants fit nicely. So Father had gone to the trouble of getting pants that fit from Sears Roebuck. But there were two unexpected Phillips to the mortician's answer. He wasn't the one who had buried my mother, incidentally. The one who buried my mother had gone bankrupt and left town to seek his fortune elsewhere. The one who was burying my father had come to seek his fortune in San Ignacio, where the streets were paved with gold. One surprising piece of news from him was that my father was going to be buried wearing a pair of his own cowboy boots, which he had been wearing when he died at the movies. The other Philip was the undertaker's assumption that Father was a Mohammedan. This was exciting to him. It was his biggest adventure in being uncritically pious in a madly pluralistic democracy. "Your father is the first Mohammedan I've taken care of," he said. "I hope I haven't done anything wrong so far. There weren't any other Mohammedans to advise me. I would have had to go all the way to Los Angeles." I didn't want to spoil his good time, so I told him that everything looked perfect to me. "Just don't eat pork too near the casket," I said. "That's all?" he said. "That," I said. "And of course you say praise Allah when you close the lid." Which he did. 9. How good were those pictures of mine which Dan Gregory looked at so briefly before he shoved merrily down the stairs? Technically, if not spiritually, they were pretty darn good for a kid my age. A kid whose self-imposed lessons had consisted of copying, stroke by stroke, illustrations by Dan Gregory. I was obviously born to draw better than most people, just as the widow Berman and Paul Slazenger were obviously born to tell stories better than most people can. Other people are obviously born to sing and dance or explain the stars in the sky or do magic tricks or be great leaders or athletes and so on. I think that could go back to the time when people had to live in small groups of relatives, maybe 50 or 100 people at the most, and evolution or God or whatever arranged things genetically to keep the little families going, to cheer them up so that they could all have somebody to tell stories around the campfire at night, and somebody else to paint pictures on the walls of the caves, and somebody else who wasn't afraid of anything, and so on. That's what I think. And of course a scheme like that doesn't make sense anymore because simply modern giftedness has been made worthless by the printing press and the radio and television and satellites and all that. A moderately gifted person who would have been a community treasure 1,000 years ago has had to give up, has to go into some other line of work, since modern communications put him or her into daily competition with nothing but world champions. The entire planet can get along nicely now with maybe a dozen champion performers in each area of human giftedness. A moderately gifted person has to keep his or her gifts all bottled up until, in a manner of speaking, he or she gets drunk at a wedding and tap dances on the coffee table like Fred Astaire or Ginger Rogers. We have a name for him or her. We call him or her an exhibitionist. How do we reward such an exhibitionist? We say to him or her the next morning, "Wow, were you ever drunk last night?" So when I became an apprentice to Dan Gregory, I was going into the ring with the world's champion of commercial art. His illustrations have made any number of gifted young artists just give up on art, thinking, "My God, I could never do anything that wonderful." I was a really cocky kid, I now realize. From the first, when I began copying Gregory, I was saying to myself, in effect, if I work hard enough, by golly, I can do that too. So there I was in Grand Central Station, with everybody but me being hugged and kissed by everybody, seemingly. I had doubted that Dan Gregory would come to meet me, but where was Marilee? Did she know what I looked like? Of course. I had sent her many self-portraits, and snapshots taken by my mother, too. Father, by the way, refused to touch a camera, saying that all it caught was dead skin and toenails and hair which people long gone had left behind. I guess he thought photographs were a poor substitute for all the people killed in the massacre. Even if Marilee hadn't seen those pictures of me, I would have been easy to spot, since I was the darkest passenger by far of any of the Pullman cars. Any passenger much darker than me in those days would have been excluded by custom from Pullman cars, and almost all hotels and theaters and restaurants. Was I sure I could spot Marilee at the station? Funnily enough, no. She had sent me 9 photographs over the years, which are now bound together with her letters. They were made with the finest equipment by Dan Gregory himself, who could easily have become a successful photographer. But Gregory had also costumed and posed her each time as a character in some story he was illustrating. The Empress Josephine, an F. Scott Fitzgerald flapper, a cave woman, a pioneer wife, a mermaid, tail and all, and so on. It was and remains hard to believe that these weren't pictures of 9 different women. There were many beauties on the platform, since the 20th Century Limited was the most glamorous train of its time. So I locked eyes with woman after woman, hoping to fire the flashbulb of recognition inside her skull. But all I succeeded in doing, I'm afraid, was to confirm for each woman that the darker races were indeed leeringly lecherous, being closer than the whiter ones to the gorillas, the chimpanzees. Polly Madison, a.k.a. Searce Berman, has just come and gone, having read what is in my typewriter without asking if I minded. I mind a lot. I'm in the middle of a sentence, I said. Who isn't, she said. I just wondered if it wasn't going to make you feel creepy writing about people so long ago. Not that I've noticed, I said. I've gotten upset by a lot of things I hadn't thought about for years. But that's about the size of it. Creepy? No. Just think about it, she said. You know about all sorts of terrible things that are going to happen to these people, yourself included. Wouldn't you like to hop into a time machine and go back to warn them, even if you could? She described an eerie scene in the Los Angeles Railroad station back in 1933. An Armenian boy with a cardboard suitcase and a portfolio is saying goodbye to his immigrant father. He's about to seek his fortune in a great city 2,500 miles away. An old man wearing an eye patch, who has just arrived in a time machine from 1987, sidles up. What does the old man say to him? I'd have to think about it, I said. I shook my head. Nothing. Cancel the time machine. Nothing, she said. I told her this. I want him to believe for as long as possible that he is going to become a great painter and a good father. Only half an hour later, she has popped in and out again. I just thought of something maybe you could use somewhere, she said. What made me think of it was what you wrote earlier about how after your father started making beautiful cowboy boots, you looked into his eyes and there wasn't anybody home anymore. Or when your friend Terry Kitchen started painting his best pictures with his spray gun, and you looked into his eyes and there wasn't anybody home anymore. I gave up. I switched off this electric typewriter. Where did I learn to touch type? I had taken a course in typing after the war, when I thought I was going to become a businessman. I sat back in this chair and I closed my eyes. Ironies go right over her head, and especially those relating to privacy. But I tried one anyway. I'm all ears, I said. I never told you the very last thing Abe said before he died, did I? She said. Never did, I agreed. That was what I was thinking about that first day, when you came down on the beach, she said. Okay, I said. At the very end, her brain surgeon husband couldn't talk anymore, but he could still scrawl short messages with his left hand, although he was normally right-handed. His left hand was all he had left that still worked a little bit. According to Searce, this was his ultimate communique. I was a radio repairman. Either his damaged brain believed that this was a literal truth, she said, or he had come to the conclusion that all the brains he had operated on were basically just receivers of signals from someplace else. Do you get the concept? I think I do, I said. Just because music comes from a little box we call a radio, she said, and here she came over and rapped me on my pate with her knuckles as though it were a radio. That doesn't mean there's a symphony orchestra inside. What's that got to do with Father and Terry Kitchen, I said. Maybe, when they suddenly started doing something they'd never done before and their personalities changed too, she said. Maybe they had started picking up signals from another station, which had very different ideas about what they should say and do. I have since tried out this human beings as nothing but radio receivers theory on Paul Slazenger, and he toyed with it some. So, Green River Cemetery is full of busted radios, he mused, and the transmitters they were tuned to still go on and on. That's the theory, I said. He said that all he'd been able to receive in his own head for the past 20 years was static, and what sounded like weather reports in some foreign language he'd never heard before. He said, too, that toward the end of his marriage to Barbara Minkin, the actress, she acted as though she was wearing headphones and listening to the 1812 Overture in stereo. That's when she was becoming a real actress, and not just another pretty girl on stage that everybody liked a lot. She wasn't even Barbara anymore. All of a sudden she was Barbira. He said that the first he heard of the name change was during the divorce proceedings, when her lawyer referred to her as Barbira, and spelled it out for the court stenographer. Out in the courthouse corridor afterwards, Slazenger asked her, "Whatever happened to Barbara?" She said Barbara was dead. So Slazenger said to her, "Then what on earth did we waste all this money on lawyers for?" I said that I had seen the same sort of thing happen to Terry Kitchen the first time he played with a spray rig, shooting bursts of red automobile paint at an old piece of beaver board he'd leaned against the potato barn. All of a sudden, he too was like somebody listening through headphones to a perfectly wonderful radio station I couldn't hear. Red was the only color he had to play with. We'd gotten 2 cans of the red paint along with the spray rig, which we'd bought from an automobile repair shop in Montauk a couple of hours before. "Just look at it! Just look at it!" he'd say after every burst. He'd just about given up on being a painter, and was going into law practice with his father before we got that spray rig, I said. Barbira was just about to give up being an actress and have a baby instead, said Slazenger. And then she got the part of Tennessee Williams' sister in The Glass Menagerie. Actually, now that I think back, Terry Kitchen went through a radical personality change the moment he saw the spray rig for sale, and not when he fired those first bursts of red at the beaver board. I happened to spot the rig and said that it was probably war surplus since it was identical with rigs I had used in the Army for camouflage. "Buy it for me," he said. "What for?" I said. "Buy it for me," he said again. He had to have it. He wouldn't even have known what it was if I hadn't told him. He never had any money, although he was from a very rich old family, and the only money I had was supposed to go for a crib and a youth bed for the house I'd bought in Springs. I was in the process of moving my family, much against their will, from the city to the country. "Buy it for me," he said again. And I said, "Okay, take it easy, okay. And now let us hop into our trusty old time machine and go back to 1932 again. Was I angry to be stood up at Grand Central Station? Not a bit. As long as I believed Dan Gregory to be the greatest artist alive, he could do no wrong. And before I was done with him and he with me, I would have to forgive him for a lot worse things than not meeting my train. What kept him from coming anywhere near to greatness, although no more marvelous technician ever lived? I have thought hard about this, and any answer I give refers to me too. I was the best technician by far among the abstract expressionists, but I never amounted to a hill of beans either, and couldn't have. And I am not talking about my fiascos with Sateen Duralux. I had painted plenty of pictures before Sateen Duralux, and quite a few afterwards, but they were no damn good. But let's forget me for the moment and focus on the works of Gregory. They were truthful about material things, but they lied about time. He celebrated moments, anything from a child's first meeting with a department store Santa Claus to the victory of a gladiator at the Circus Maximus, from the driving of the Golden Spike which completed the Transcontinental Railroad to a man's going on his knees to ask a woman to marry him. But he lacked the guts or the wisdom, or maybe just the talent, to indicate somehow that time was liquid, that one moment was no more important than any other, and that all moments quickly run away. Let me put it another way. Dan Gregory was a taxidermist. He stuffed and mounted and varnished and moth-proofed supposedly great moments, all of which turn out to be depressing dust catchers, like a moose head bought at a country auction, or a sailfish on the wall of a dentist's waiting room. Clear? Let me put it yet another way. Life, by definition, is never still. Where is it going? From birth to death, with no stops on the way. Even a picture of a bowl of pears on a checkered tablecloth is liquid, if laid on canvas by the brush of a master. Yes, and by some miracle I was surely never able to achieve as a painter, nor was Dan Gregory, but which was achieved by the best of the abstract expressionists. In the paintings which have greatness, birth and death are always there. Birth and death were even on that old piece of beaver board Terry Kitchen sprayed at seeming random so long ago. I don't know how he got them in there, and neither did he. I sigh. "Ah me," says old Rabo Karabakian.